Imagine standing on a frozen shoreline more than 1,000 years ago, the wind cutting through your bones, the sea black and endless before you, and somewhere beyond that horizon, a name is already being whispered with fear and awe, a name that would echo through history, legend, and blood-soaked songs, a name that still refuses to die even today. Ragnar Lothbrok. But here is the question that has haunted historians, scholars, and storytellers for centuries. Was Ragnar Lothbrok a real man of flesh and bone? Or was he nothing more than a myth stitched together from the victories of many warriors? Because when we strip away the television dramatization, the poetic sagas, and the heroic fantasies, what remains is far more mysterious, far darker, and far more fascinating than any simple answer. And this story begins not with certainty, but with contradiction, because the earliest sources that mention Ragnar do not come from his own time, they come centuries later, written by people who never met him, who relied on oral tales passed down by fireside storytellers who exaggerated, reshaped, and mythologized reality, turning men into monsters and warriors into gods. Yet despite this fog of myth, the name Ragnar Lothbrok appears again and again like a shadow that refuses to fade, appearing in Norse sagas, in Latin chronicles, and in the terrified records of Christian monks who watched their world burn under Viking axes. And these monks did not write legends. They wrote reports of terror, of longships emerging from the mist, of churches looted, of kings defeated, and among these records, one raid stands out as a turning point in European history. The infamous attack on Paris in the year 845, where a Viking leader led hundreds of ships up the river Seine, defeated the Frankish armies, and forced King Charles the Bald to pay an enormous ransom just to make them leave. And according to later sources, that leader was Ragnar himself. But here's where the mystery deepens, because the Frankish chronicles name the Viking leader as Ragnar, not Ragnar Lothbrok. So are these two men the same person, or is this where myth begins to overwrite fact? Because Ragnar disappears from the records shortly after, reportedly dying of disease, yet the Ragnar of Norse sagas lives on, fathers legendary sons, challenges kings, defies gods, and meets a dramatic death in a snake pit. A death so theatrical that it feels designed not for history, but for legend. And this is exactly why historians remain divided. Some believe Ragnar was a real Viking warlord whose story was later expanded, while others argue he was a symbolic figure, a legendary ancestor created to unify multiple heroic lineages under one powerful name. And when we look at his supposed sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Ub Vitsirk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, things become even more complicated. Because these men are absolutely real, their campaigns are well documented. Their invasions reshaped England, Ireland, and Francia, and yet their father appears only in stories, almost as if history remembers the children, but not the man who created them. Which raises an uncomfortable question: did Ragnar exist at all? Or was he invented to give these terrifying conquerors a larger-than-life origin? Because in Viking culture, lineage was power, and claiming descent from a legendary hero elevated status, inspired loyalty, and justified conquest. And this is where myth and truth collide, because Norse society did not separate history from storytelling the way we do today. To them, a story that inspired courage and fear was more important than strict accuracy. And this is why Ragnar's tale is filled with symbolic elements. The enchanted trousers said to protect him from snake venom, the prophecies of his sons, the poetic last words spoken as he dies laughing in the face of death, declaring that he will feast with the gods in Valhalla, lines that perfectly embody the Viking ideal of fearless defiance. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries, this is the perfect moment to support Viking Saga by hitting that subscribe button, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Because your support helps keep these legendary stories alive. And as we move deeper into Ragnar's life, we must ask another dangerous question. If Ragnar was not one man, then who were the men behind the legend? Because history offers us several candidates. Powerful Viking leaders whose deeds align suspiciously well with different parts of Ragnar's story. Warriors who raided England, Francia. Powerful Viking leaders whose deeds align suspiciously well with different parts of Ragnar's story. Warriors who raided England, Francia, and Ireland across different decades, whose victories may have been stitched together into one unstoppable figure. And as we unravel these threads, the line between man and myth grows thinner, because the truth may be far more unsettling than fiction. And the world Ragnar came from was brutal, unforgiving, and obsessed with glory, where man's name survived only if it was soaked in blood and remembered in song. And whether Ragnar was one man or many, the impact of his legend shaped the Viking Age itself, inspiring generations of raiders to chase fame beyond the edge of the known world, believing that death was not the end, but the gateway to eternal honor. And this belief fueled invasions so vast that Europe itself was forced to change, fortifying cities, reshaping armies, and rewriting the balance of power, all because of the fear inspired by names like Ragnar Lothbrok. And yet the deeper we dig, the more we realize that the real story is not about certainty. It is about how legends are born, how fear becomes memory, and how memory becomes myth. And as we continue this journey, the evidence will grow darker, the theories more dangerous, and the truth more elusive. Because sometimes the most powerful figures in history are not remembered because they were real, but because people needed them to be real. And in the next part, we will descend into the Norse sagas themselves, separating symbolism from possible fact, uncovering Ragnar's marriages, his battles, and the terrifying legacy of revenge that his sons unleashed upon the world. A legacy that may be the strongest proof that somewhere beneath the myth, a real Ragnar once walked the earth. As we step deeper into the Norse sagas, the world around Ragnar Lothbrok begins to feel less like documented history and more like a dream stitched together from blood, prophecy, and firelight, because the sagas do not introduce Ragnar as an ordinary man. They introduce him as destiny itself, a figure whose life unfolds according to omens and fate, beginning with his first legendary marriage to the shield maiden Lagertha, a woman described as fierce, fearless, and equal to any man in battle. A detail that alone tells us something important about Viking storytelling, because these tales were not written to record events, but to reflect ideals, power, courage, loyalty, and strength. And Lagertha represents the untamed spirit of the old pagan world, a world Ragnar eventually leaves behind when he divorces her. Not because of love lost, but because the saga demands a new chapter, one that leads him to Thora Borgarjurt, the woman guarded by a monstrous serpent. And here the line between myth and symbolism nearly vanishes, because Ragnar does not simply fight the beast. He wears fur trousers soaked in tar and sand, the famous hairy breeches that give him the name Lothbrok. A moment so fantastical it almost begs to be metaphorical, a hero donning protection to overcome an impossible threat, a story that mirrors countless mythological trials across cultures. Yet after Thora's death, Ragnar's story does not slow. It grows darker, more tragic, and more human with the arrival of Aslaug, a woman said to be the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, a lineage that further ties Ragnar to a mythic bloodline, and with Aslaug come his most infamous sons, each marked not only by strength but by prophecy, because from the moment they are born, their futures are foretold. Wars, betrayals, vengeance, and conquest written into their fate, and this obsession with destiny is crucial because it reflects how Vikings understood their world. They believed their lives were already woven by the Norns, and all a man could do was walk forward with courage. Knowing how he would die mattered less than how he lived, and Ragnar embodies this belief completely, because as the sagas describe his rise, we see a man driven not just by conquest, but by the fear of being forgotten, a fear that becomes his undoing. Because as his sons grow stronger and more famous, Ragnar fades into their shadow, an aging warrior watching his legacy slip away. And this is where the sagas suddenly feel painfully real, because the greatest enemy of any legend is time, and Ragnar's final campaign, the one that leads him to England, is not portrayed as a calculated invasion, but as a desperate attempt to reclaim glory. Sailing with too few ships, ignoring warnings, challenging fate itself, and when he is captured by King Ella of Northumbria, the story reaches its most iconic moment, the snake pit, a death so vivid it feels etched into cultural memory, venomous serpents coiling around him, biting into his flesh, and Ragnar, instead of begging, laughs, declaring that his sons will avenge him, that the little piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered, a line so powerful it echoes across centuries. But here again, historians hesitate, because no contemporary English source mentions such a death. No record of a snake pit execution exists. And yet, shortly after this supposed event, the great heathen army descends upon England with unmatched fury, led by Ragnar's sons, devastating kingdoms, executing kings, and reshaping the political map forever. And this timing is too perfect to ignore, because whether or not Ragnar died in a pit of snakes, something sparked this invasion, something deeply personal, something rooted in revenge. And this is where myth and reality may finally touch, because even if the details are exaggerated, the emotional truth remains: a fallen leader, a call for vengeance, and sons driven by rage and destiny. And if this story is gripping you, if you can feel the weight of this ancient world pressing closer, this is your moment to stand with Viking Saga. Drop a like. Leave a comment with your thoughts on whether Ragnar was real or legend, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what comes next is not just conquest, it is terror on a scale medieval Europe had never seen, and as we move forward, we must confront the strongest argument for Ragnar's existence, the actions of his sons. Because legends may inspire, but only real men can burn kingdoms to the ground. And in the next part, we will follow the great heathen army itself, step by brutal step, as it tears through England, seeking not just land or gold, but revenge written in blood. And through this path of destruction, we may finally uncover whether Ragnar Lothbrok was a man whose shadow shaped history, or a myth born from the need to explain unstoppable violence in a world drowning in fear. And as the great heathen army spreads like a living storm across England, the final pieces of the Ragnar puzzle begin to slide into place. Because this invasion is unlike anything Europe has witnessed before, not a quick raid for silver or slaves, but a grinding, relentless campaign of domination that moves with intent, strategy, and chilling patience, wintering in enemy lands, learning terrain, exploiting rivalries between kingdoms, and striking with a precision that suggests experienced leadership and a shared cause. And when chroniclers describe the banners flying above this army, the raven standard appears again and again, a symbol deeply tied to Odin and to the Ragnar lineage and saga tradition, believed to rise and fall depending on the favor of the gods. And whether this belief was real or psychological warfare hardly matters, because the effect was devastating. Entire populations surrendered without battle, convinced they were facing not just men but fate itself. And this is where Ragnar's presence, real or imagined, becomes undeniable, because even in death, he functions as the emotional engine of conquest, a fallen patriarch whose story gives moral permission for extreme violence. And history shows us repeatedly that armies fight hardest not for gold, but for meaning. And the meaning here is revenge sanctified by destiny. And as Northumbria falls, and Mercia trembles, and Wessex barely survives, the idea of Ragnar evolves again, no longer just a legendary raider, but a catalyst, a name used to unify warriors from different regions, different jarls, even different ambitions under one narrative. And this supports the theory held by many modern historians that Ragnar Lothbrok may represent a composite figure, a symbolic ancestor created by later storytellers to explain how so many powerful leaders could act with such unity. Because humans crave origin stories, especially when faced with chaos, and the Christian world was desperate to explain why God would allow such destruction, while the Norse world needed to believe their expansion was ordained, and Ragnar satisfies both needs, a villain to one side, a heroic progenitor to the other. And yet there are moments where the myth falters just enough to reveal a human outline beneath. Because the sagas do not portray Ragnar as flawless, they show him making mistakes, misjudging enemies, underestimating kings, and ultimately dying not in glory but in captivity, stripped of weapons, stripped of command, relying only on words to preserve his legacy. And that detail feels too honest, too uncomfortable to be pure invention. Because legends usually avoid weakness unless that weakness serves a greater lesson, and here the lesson is unmistakable. Fame fades, strength decays, and only reputation survives, a warning Ragnar himself seems to understand as he speaks defiantly before death, ensuring that even if his body is broken, his name will provoke action, and provoke it does, because after the initial wave of vengeance, Ragnar's sons do not simply return home satisfied. They settle, rule, and reshape societies, blending Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures, laying foundations for future kingdoms, proving that whatever began as revenge evolved into something permanent. And permanence is the true measure of historical impact, and this is why the question, was Ragnar real? May be the wrong question entirely, because reality is not always confined to birth records and dated documents. Sometimes reality is measured by consequence. And by that measure, Ragnar Lothbrok is undeniably real. His story changed behavior, justified wars, inspired generations, and still grips imaginations today, including yours right now as you listen to these words. And if you're still here, still riding this longship through fog and fire, you are already part of the saga, and Viking Saga exists for one reason: to keep these ancient echoes alive. So take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Viking Saga, and leave a comment with your verdict, myth man, or something far more dangerous in between. Because in the final part of this journey, we will confront the last and most unsettling idea of all: that Ragnar Lothbrok's greatest achievement was not conquest or fatherhood or legend, but the creation of a story so powerful that even after 1,000 years, we are still asking who he was, and in doing so, we ensure that whatever the truth may be, Ragnar never truly dies. And now the story reaches the most controversial and intellectually dangerous territory of all. Because to continue forward, we must confront the theory that unsettles both historians and fans alike: the idea that Ragnar Lothbrok was never meant to be understood as a single individual, but as a narrative convergence, a deliberate blending of several powerful Viking leaders into one immortal identity. And this theory exists not to erase Ragnar, but to explain him, because when scholars align timelines, raid locations, and political contexts, they notice something impossible if Ragnar were only one man. Events attributed to him span decades that would require him to be both young and old at the same time, active in regions separated by years of travel with no gaps in between. And while legends easily ignore such constraints, real lives do not. And so historians began identifying real figures whose actions mirror specific chapters of Ragnar's saga, leaders who attacked Francia, England, and Ireland, whose victories match different episodes, suggesting that later storytellers may have fused these men together into a single archetypal hero. A process not uncommon in oral cultures, where memory compresses complexity into symbolism and symbolism into names. And this is not deception, it is preservation, because a single powerful name survives longer than a list of forgotten warlords. And in Viking society, survival of memory was everything, because death was inevitable, but obscurity was dishonor, and so the name Ragnar becomes a vessel, carrying the weight of multiple lifetimes, allowing communities to point backward and say, this is where we came from. This is why we rule. This is why we conquer. And when you examine how Ragnar is remembered, it is never through mundane details, never through trade agreements or domestic policy, but through moments of extreme meaning. Impossible courage, defiant laughter, prophetic speech. Because those are the moments that last, and perhaps the clearest evidence of this narrative construction lies in how Ragnar's failures are treated. Because unlike pure mythic heroes, he is allowed to fall, to misjudge, to lose, and that fall is essential. Because it creates the emotional vacuum that his sons fill with violence and ambition, turning personal tragedy into historical momentum. And this pattern appears again and again across human storytelling, from ancient epics to medieval legends, because stories need inheritance, a passing of the torch soaked in blood. And Ragnar provides exactly that. And yet, even if Ragnar is a composite, the psychological reality he represents is undeniably real, the Viking Age itself, an era driven by scarcity, ambition, and belief, where men sailed into the unknown not because it was safe, but because dying unknown was worse. And Ragnar's legend captures this mindset perfectly. A man who refuses to fade quietly, who chooses a dangerous final gamble over a slow disappearance. And that choice resonates because it is human, painfully human. And this is why his story refuses to settle into a neat academic conclusion. Because it operates on multiple levels at once, as possible history, as cultural myth, and as existential metaphor. And this layered reality explains why modern audiences remain obsessed. Because Ragnar is not just a Viking story. He is a story about legacy anxiety, about the fear of being surpassed, about the terror of watching the world change without you. And these fears are timeless, crossing centuries with ease. And if you listen closely, you can hear how Ragnar's voice echoes in every empire that rose and fell afterward, every ruler who feared irrelevance more than death, every leader who gambled everything for one final moment of greatness. And this is where the myth becomes more powerful than fact, because facts inform, but myths motivate. And Ragnar motivated an age, shaping how Vikings understood themselves and how the rest of the world understood Vikings, turning them from scattered raiders into a civilization with a shared identity, a shared origin, and a shared destiny. And as this realization settles in, the question shifts once more, no longer asking, did Ragnar exist? But asking, why did Ragnar need to exist? And the answer lies in chaos, because the Viking expansion was violent, disruptive, and terrifying, and chaos demands explanation, and Ragnar provided one, a single name to focus fear, blame, and awe. A human face for an unstoppable force, and even today, as you sit listening to this story through a screen rather than a fire, you are participating in the same ancient process, turning uncertainty into narrative, history into meaning. And if this realization has pulled you deeper into the saga, doubt tightening its grip, then you already understand why Viking Saga exists, to explore not just what happened, but why it mattered. So stay with this journey, because in the next part we will confront the final evidence, the silence of the sources, the gaps that refuse to close, and the unsettling possibility that the truth about Ragnar Lothbrok is not hidden in what was written, but in what was deliberately left unsaid. And now we arrive at the most haunting evidence of all, not what the sources say, but what they refuse to say. Because history is often defined as much by silence as by words. And when we examine the contemporary records closest to Ragnar's supposed lifetime, we encounter an unsettling quiet. A gap where a man of such enormous influence should thunder across the page. And instead, we find fragments, half-names, distorted echoes, Viking leaders described without lineage, victories recorded without origins, raids noted without a singular mastermind. And this absence has driven historians mad for centuries because it feels intentional. As if Ragnar exists just outside the frame of certainty, close enough to feel real, yet distant enough to evade capture. And one explanation for this silence lies in the worldview of those doing the recording. Christian monks who chronicled Viking attacks were not interested in preserving Norse heroes. They were interested in recording suffering, punishment, divine testing, and moral lessons. And to them, Vikings were not individuals worthy of detailed biography, but instruments of chaos sent to scourge the faithful. And so names were often secondary to devastation. Places mattered more than people. And yet, even within this hostile framework, certain Viking leaders emerge clearly, their names repeated, their actions traced, which makes Ragnar's absence even more disturbing, because it suggests either he was not as singular as later stories claim, or that his story was still forming, still fluid, not yet crystallized into legend. And this supports the idea that Ragnar's identity solidified after his death, shaped by the needs of those who came after, especially his sons. Because when the great heathen army tears through England, the narrative suddenly sharpens. Revenge becomes central, lineage becomes important, and Ragnar's name gains clarity and purpose, almost as if history itself reaches backward to invent a cause worthy of the destruction unfolding. And this backward construction of meaning is not unusual. Humans constantly reinterpret the past to justify the present, and in doing so, they create ancestors larger than life. And Ragnar fits this pattern perfectly because his story explains why the sons were so united, so relentless, so cruel. It transforms political conquest into sacred duty. And yet, even if Ragnar was shaped after the fact, that shaping process itself reveals a truth about the Viking Age, that it was an era desperately in need of coherence, of stories strong enough to bind scattered clans into a shared identity, and Ragnar provided that anchor. A symbolic father whose imagined suffering demanded collective response. And when we accept this, the lack of hard evidence stops feeling like a flaw and starts feeling like a feature. Because Ragnar's power lies precisely in his ambiguity, he is real enough to inspire belief, vague enough to absorb countless retellings, and flexible enough to evolve with each generation. And this explains why later medieval writers embraced him so eagerly, weaving his tale into sagas that blurred chronology, enhanced drama, and prioritized emotional truth over factual precision, because by then, Ragnar was no longer just a man. He was a cultural inheritance, and cultures protect their inheritance by mythologizing it, polishing rough edges, and amplifying meaning. And this mythologizing reached its peak in Ragnar's death, because no matter which version you hear, snake pit, execution, illness, betrayal, the outcome is the same. His end is humiliating enough to demand revenge, but dignified enough to preserve honor. A perfect narrative balance that feels crafted rather than recorded. And that balance is a storyteller's signature, not an archivist's. And yet, despite all this skepticism, something stubborn remains, a sense that beneath the layers of myth there was a spark. A real individual whose actions were extraordinary enough to require explanation. Because myths rarely emerge from nothing, they grow from seeds of reality watered by fear, admiration, and repetition. And perhaps Ragnar was one such seed. A successful raider, a regional king, a man whose exploits were impressive but not unique until memory stretched him, until songs embroidered him, until his name became a banner under which an age marched. And this possibility is what makes the story so unsettling, because it suggests that history is not lost when facts blur, but transformed, reshaped into something that reveals how people felt rather than what exactly happened. And as we approach the end of this journey, one truth becomes unavoidable. Ragnar Lothbrok may never be proven real or false in the way modern minds crave. But his impact is measurable. His shadow falls across centuries. His legend changed behavior, justified violence, inspired loyalty, and still commands attention today. And if you have stayed with Viking Saga through this long exploration, you already understand why this story refuses to die. Because it mirrors our own fears about legacy, relevance, and remembrance. And in the final part, we will bring everything together, confronting the ultimate conclusion, not a verdict of true or false, but a deeper answer to why Ragnar Lothbrok matters more than certainty ever could, and why some names survive not because they are proven, but because they are needed. And now the journey reaches its final shore, where certainty dissolves and meaning takes its place. Because after everything we have examined, every fragment of saga, every hostile chronicle, every silent gap in the record, the truth about Ragnar Lothbrok does not arrive as a clear answer, but as a realization that some figures endure not because they can be proven, but because they explain the world that created them. And Ragnar explains the Viking Age better than any date or document ever could. Because he embodies its hunger, its fear of obscurity, its obsession with honor, and its belief that a man's aim could outlive his body if it was carried far enough on the wind of violence and song. And when we look at the consequences attributed to him, unification of purpose among his sons, the scale of the great heathen army, the psychological terror inflicted on medieval Europe, the reshaping of kingdoms and identities, it becomes clear that whether Ragnar was one man, many men, or an idea given flesh, his existence altered behavior, and in history, behavior is reality, because myths that change how people act become forces as tangible as steel. And Ragnar's myth forged decisions, inspired loyalty, justified revenge, and transformed scattered raids into an age-defining movement. And this is why the question myth or truth ultimately collapses under its own weight, because Ragnar is both true in impact and mythic in form, real in consequence and legendary in memory, and perhaps this duality is the most honest answer history can give us. Because the Viking world did not divide life into neat categories. To them, gods walked among men, fate shaped every step, And stories were not entertainment but instruction, teaching how to live and how to die, and Ragnar's final lesson is the one that echoes loudest. That obscurity is the greatest death, and that to be remembered, one must become larger than life, even if that means becoming something history can never fully pin down. And this is why 1,000 years later his name still commands attention, why scholars still argue, why storytellers still return to him, and why you are still here listening, because in seeking Ragnar, we are really seeking ourselves, our own fear of being forgotten, our own desire for meaning beyond mortality. And this is where Viking Saga finds its purpose, not to give easy answers, but to explore the space where history and legend collide, where certainty ends and understanding begins. And if this long voyage through shadow and fire has held you until now, then you are already part of the saga. So take that final step. Like the video, subscribe to Viking Saga, and leave your mark in the comments with what you believe Ragnar Lothbrok truly was. Because stories only survive when they are shared, and legends only live when someone is still willing to speak their name. And as long as Ragnar is spoken, questioned, and remembered, whether as man, myth, or something in between, he has achieved the one victory every Viking sought above all others: immortality.